King Ahab, king of the northern tribes of Israel, was a wicked king. 1 Kings 16:30. He allowed idolatry in Israel, promoting the worship of the Canaanite god Baal, the god of lightning, wind, rain, and fertility. Notice, by the way, that Baal is like the worship of this false god, all instead of and in place of the real God, Jesus, who satisfies. Worshipping the weather, the environment, worshipping immorality, that is like an immoral version of sex. All that is not too irrelevant today. It's just in a different form, is it not? But as a result of this evil that King Ahab indulged in, Elijah the prophet became a thorn in Ahab's side. So Elijah proposed a power encounter between Baal and Yahweh, the true God of Israel. 1 Kings 18:16-46. Ahab gathered 850 of the prophets of Baal and Asherah, consort goddess of Baal. This is all, ridiculous nonsense, but this is the religion of the day. And they all met Elijah on Mount Carmel. The contest Elijah proposed was this. Each party would sacrifice a bull on an altar and call upon their God, to send down fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice. The prophets of Baal thought this would be a slam dunk since Baal was the god of lightning. The Baal team went first, arranging a bull on their altar. From morning until noon, they danced around the altar and shouted out to Baal to send down fire from heaven and consume the sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered. Verse 26. So the Baal team did more. From noon until evening, they shouted, prophesied, and cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out on them. Verse 28. Still no answer. I'm going to depart from the biblical text at this point and suggest what I think the prophets of Baal were thinking, writes David Jeremiah. Isn't that just like Baal? We dance, we shout, we plead, we spill our blood for this God, and what does he do? Nothing. Not a word. He's the God of lightning, and he couldn't be bothered to send us one bolt. You probably know the rest of the story. Elijah called on God to send fire to consume the sacrifice, and he did. The first time. Ahab and the prophets of Baal didn't know what to expect from their God, but Elijah knew what to expect of a true God of Israel. After the contest was over and the false prophets were humiliated, I can just hear Elijah chuckling, isn't that just like God? Living with God through Christ is a never-ending series of amazing surprises and life-changing encounters. If you've not experienced this, you can't manipulate God to do what you want, but you probably indeed weren't talking to the real God through the real God's way. That is Jesus, the real Jesus of the Bible. Not the cult, not any other text, but the Bible. The ancient biblical world was full of false gods who were pretty much all the same. They were all man-made with self-centered personalities who used their human subjects to serve them. They were capricious, vengeful, unreliable, and self-serving. Kind of like the people that worshipped these idols and therefore became like them, and so on and so forth. But as the biblical story unfolded, Israel learned that their God, Yahweh, was not like the pagan gods. He loved them, blessed them, served them, protected them because of their faith in him. The opposite of what the pagan gods did, because they don't even exist. Then, when the fullest revelation of God happened in the incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth, the character of God became even better known. Ultimately, the God of Israel, in the person of Christ, went so far as to die for his people and the world, because he loved them and he wants to save them from all eternity in hell, where they are sentenced by reason of consequence, even though they were never meant to go to hell. And so by Jesus dying on the cross in our place and rising from the dead, he paid the penalty as the criminal that we are, and in essence paid the debt and offers that freedom to us if we just simply believe he is the Christ, the God who died and rose again. Ask him to forever forgive and save us. He will. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Just if you call out to him right now and ask him to forever forgive and save you, Jesus, the real God, he will do it. This was unheard of in the ancient world. Pagan gods didn't live for their subjects, much less die for them, but Jesus did. The phrase, "isn't that just like God?" took on new dimensions in the person of Christ. As a result, living with God through Christ is a never-ending series of amazing surprises and life-changing encounters. Not only are we never disappointed with God, like when we need him, like the Baal prophets were disappointed with their God, our expectations of him grow daily. Let's think about a few ways we just find ourselves saying, isn't that just like God? If the God who created the universe was going to come to earth to reconcile humanity to himself, how do you imagine he would do it? Remember the history of deities prior to Jesus' incarnation. They viewed themselves as better than their subjects. Kings and gods of the period lived lavishly, depending on their subjects to meet their needs and serve their agendas. So when Jesus came to earth as a humble baby, born in a manger, his birth surprised everyone. Even as an adult, Jesus had nowhere to lay his head, Luke 9:58. Isaiah the prophet's prediction that he would have no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, Isaiah 53:2, or any unusual appearance proved to be true. His clothing and appearance were not those of royalty. He looked like a typical Jewish man of his day. What kind of God or king would bend down and wash the dust and dirt off his disciples' feet before a meal? John 13:1-17. What kind of God or king would share a meal with the outcasts of society? Mark 2:15-16. What kind of God or king would forgive those who were caught breaking the law? John 8:1-11. A God and king like Jesus, a God who is full of surprises. Isn't it just like God to do the unexpected? You've heard of a baker's dozen. Tradition suggests adding an extra item to an order of 12 wasn't a pure act of generosity, but when it comes to how God gives it to us, it is. It is not unusual for us to pray for something and receive through Jesus and receive more than we expected. Paul wrote that God is just that generous. Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, to him be glory. Ephesians 3:20-21. Our God is a giving God, for God so loved the world that he gave. John 3:16. And Romans 8:32. He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? Isn't it just like God to give beyond what we would expect? It is not unusual for us to pray for something through Jesus, the real Jesus, and receive more than we expected. It's a promise, according to his purposes and his heart of generosity. If you or I were God, how many times would we be willing to forgive the sins of our subjects? The answer to that question is found in the degree to which we struggle to forgive one another. In our natural selves, we find it hard to forgive unconditionally or infinitely. We find ourselves thinking like Peter. He guessed that 7 times would be a gracious plenty, Matthew 18:21-22. But Jesus defied Peter's and our expectations when he said, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7, verse 22. Obviously, Jesus didn't mean 490 times. He meant we shouldn't count at all. We should simply forgive unconditionally like God does, for our own good, like to not carry around burdens and stuff. The Apostle Paul wrote that there is always more grace than there is sin, Romans 5:20. When it comes to how God forgives us, our sins can never consume all his grace. Isn't it just like God to surprise us with forgiveness whenever we sin? Here's something we could think about for the rest of the day or year. The psalmist David was considering the heavens, the moon and the stars, Psalm 8:3, and the glory of the universe. Then it dawned on him, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? Verse 4. David was amazed that the God who created the universe also cares about tiny human beings. Plus, God entered into a partnership with man, making him steward of creation, verses 5-8. In Psalm 139, David expands on God's care for us as individuals. He created us in our mother's wombs and planned the days of our lives, verses 13-16. He even knows the number of hairs on our heads, Luke 12:7. Isn't it just like God to want to have a relationship with tiny human beings? The more difficult things get in our life, the closer to us he seems to get. And even in joy and celebration of victory and redemption, hopefully even closer. Finally, the most welcome thing we discover about God is that he is not a fair weather God. He is the God of good seasons and of bad. He is not a God who is with us only when we are doing what pleases him or when things are going well. In fact, the more difficult things get in our life, the closer to us he seems to get. Like a loving father, he doesn't want difficult times to cause us to turn away from him. He promises to take all the events of our life and cause them to work together for good. Romans 8:28. He knows what we need and is there to provide. Luke 11:11-13. Isn't it just like God to never leave us or forsake us? That's Bible. Like it says that in the scriptures that if we believe in him, he will never leave us nor forsake us. So like we serve a God who exceeds our expectations and never disappoints in what we need, and even sometimes in what we want. because he'll always take it and make it better or give it to us exactly or more. And it's just like for his purposes and because he's so good and kind and he loves you. He really is amazing. Like, literally. Celebrate him each day as you consider how much he loves you.